Hey everybody, this is the video for the next project, which is your pointillist work. I just want to review a little bit on the color theory. I'm going to post that video, so I'm a little bit late doing that. You have the two different color wheels, a subtractive color wheel, which is what we use when we're working with pigments. The primary colors are red, yellow, blue. Secondaries are green, violet, orange. And you have the additive color wheel, which is colors when you're working with actual light, which would be stage lighters, photographers, and other artists like that. The primaries are different on the additive color wheel. Those are the actual colors that are in the spectrum. And the primaries are red, green, blue. Secondaries are yellow, magenta, and cyan. And you can see the complements. We've got all those different color harmonies that I discussed in the lecture. The complements are a little bit similar. Complements are directly opposite. I'm going to be talking about that a little bit for the Pointillist project today. You've got yellow and violet, which is a little bit similar to blue and yellow over here. Over here you've got blue and orange, and you've got red and cyan, which is a little bit similar to that. And then you have red and green, and you have green and magenta. So they're kind of similar, but not exactly the same. Okay, so just think about that when so now I'll start talking about pointillism a little bit. Make sure to review the lecture. I have lots of beautiful examples of pointillist works and student works that were done for this project too. So I just want to talk briefly about what pointillism was about. It was a movement in the late 19th century. It was developed by Georges Seurat and Paul Signac. And what they did was they started using little dots and doing visual color mixing. So you can see in this painting, it's a section of Parade de Sucre, painted by Georges Seurat, who's probably the best known of the pointillist artists. And you can see, if you look at the close-up here, that they're just numerous little dots overlapping each other. Some artists will actually leave some white, of the canvas or the paper or whatever showing through, and others will have almost total overlapping like you see here. When you look at the paintings from farther away, as in one of his most famous paintings, Ile de la Grande Jatte, it looks a little bit more outlined and graphic in style. If you look at the trees over here, you can see some more of the dots. But if you were standing right in front of the painting, you would be able to see, it become just sort of like an abstraction of little dots. And then all of these different colors of dots create a certain effect. They create the visual color mixing, and then they also create this beautiful effect of what I call shimmer on the surface, because you've got all of these dots of color interacting with each other. So here's an example of a painting by Paul Signac, who's one of the other well-known pointillist painters, and Femme au Puits. And if you look at this blow-up over here, you can see this little area here, which appears to be mostly like a green, is actually made up of green, yellow, and blue. And that would be, a lot of the times they would use green, blue, and red, which are the primaries for the additive light color wheel. But you can really use any type of color you want. Here you've got heightened color. Looks kind of like the natural landscape, but it's more intensified. It really depends on what's going on, what you feel like doing, and the image you're doing. Now, another artist who worked in the pointillist style was Van Gogh, Vincent van Gogh. We've already watched a video about him. I'm sure you're familiar with his work. He did numerous, I think about 75 self-portraits. You can see in these self-portraits he used the pointillist technique. Pointillism is also referred to as Neo-Impressionism because it was a movement that came out of Impressionism. Impressionism, they started using strokes and dabs of color, pigment directly onto the canvas, painting outdoors. And then Pointillism took it a step further, where they were having those little dots. Well, you can see some of the Pointillist painters, and as Van Gogh didn't use dots all the time. They used sort of like little brush strokes, which you could try if you feel like doing that. And you can see they used often a lot of complements. You've got blues and oranges and reds and greens in this particular portrait here. And And then the last example I'm going to show you, and I have many more examples in the lecture, so be sure to read that, is a painting by Henry Edmond Cross, another French pointillist artist. And this is called Ile d'Or. This is not exactly representative of the colors. I actually have a beautiful canvas print of this. But you can see in this it's very much abstracted. And you've got this sort of layering going from larger dots to smaller until you get off into the distance. A beautiful scene, you know, of the ocean and a beach and the hills off in the distance. So that was what I took for my inspiration. I took a photograph. I do primarily photography now for my art, although I've done a large amount of painting as well. And I decided to use this photo as a subject for the pointillist painting. So what I did, normally what I would do when I'm doing something like this is I would do a scale drawing from my photograph. What you can do if you want to work with a photograph, you can do that. You can work from your imagination. It could be a landscape, it can really be anything, and you'll look at all those student examples. But if you want to quickly get the composition down, what you can do is just, instead of doing that trace transfer process that I showed you with the perspective drawing, you just flip over the back of your image, draw over it with a soft pencil, flip it back, tape it onto your page, and then just draw over the basic outline of the composition. So here was my result. This is probably like 3/4 of the way done. I'm going to keep layering. And I worked with markers. You can see I wasn't trying to go for an exact representation. I let it be more abstracted, and I left a lot of the white of the paper showing through. I'll probably end up covering some of that up as I keep layering on top of it. Now, I chose to use markers. You can use whatever you want. Markers, pencils. You could use paint. If you want to use paint, you know, you can use the end of your brush. You can use these little dropper things to make dots. You could do smaller dots, larger dots. You could try your brush if you want to, whatever technique you would like to use. I used these Staedtler markers, which have 2 different points. They have a brush point on one side and a finer point on the other side. And then I always will take a little sample here. Just be careful to do this because sometimes whatever the color looks like, you know, on the cover is not the actual color that the marker is going to be. I actually had one that had a yellow cover and it was dark gray. And I made a little bit of a mistake with that. So just test it out. And what I recommend doing is testing out and experimenting with the pointillist technique before you go ahead and start working on your composition. Now what I did with mine, you can see, is I kind of approximated the value range. The black to white value range is very important in the work. And even if it's something that's going to be in color, like this work, you can see the darker value is in the foreground. You've got some sort of darker values over here, and then it goes into a mid-range, and then it's more muted and grayed down in the background. And that helps to create a feeling of distance in the work. So what I did was I started working on the top part. I mostly did smaller dots in the background, although I have some larger dots in here, so I used both sides. And in the foreground, I used more the brush side when I was using these markers and larger dots. But I did have some areas where I will add the little dots in, so I'm kind of just, you know, I just have like my own way of doing it, but you can try whatever you want. And you can see what I'm doing here. I hope you can see from here. Maybe I can hold it up a little bit closer. Is that I actually have, if you look at this area over here, I actually have some metallic paint. And here I have a lot of different colors in there. I'm not just doing this monochromatically. You could try the monochromatic technique, but the whole point of the pointillist technique is to do that color mixing. So for instance, if you were doing, I'm going to do something on another paper. To give you an example, if you were doing something where you're working with blue, these are actually watercolor markers, so you're getting kind of a lighter effect depending on the color that you're using. If I wanted to make that look like it's more off in the distance, like I did with some of the things that are going on in the background of the composition, I would add in the complement. That's called neutralizing it. In that very first video that you watched the first day, I talked about how you take the complements, mix them together, and eventually get gray. Well, if you want to tone down a color make it less saturated in order to create spatial depth, or for whatever reason, you can just add the complement a little bit into it. So I'm going to show you what would happen with that just by adding some orange. And you can experiment, you know, on your, have maybe a whole separate sheet where you just experiment. You can see that it's not getting that intense, and then you're going to get some mixing in there. It looks a little bit yellow and everything. Now, if you want to lighten up an area, say you're doing something and you feel like it got a little bit too dark or whatever, you want to tone it down. Another way you can do it is by adding some white on top. Let me just try that. I used a purple there. That's actually blue, but it looks more purple. I'm going to add another, more of a teal blue. If I want to tone this down, then I can go into with white. Now these, the Staedtler markers, the watercolor ones, don't have white, but I went out and I didn't have all my materials because they're still at school during the pandemic. I went out and bought some silver markers, various different brands. This is an Artist Loft, and a calligraphy marker, and I bought, this was my favorite one. I think I'm going to buy some more of these and do an entire painting because it's a little bit larger job, but you still have the kind of control that you have when you're working with a marker or a pen or something. Although my preference would probably be for Pointillism to do painting and use those little droppers or my end of my brush maybe. But this one you can see has got a nice thick point. And then if I want to go back into something, if it got a little bit too dark or whatever, I just want to do some highlighting, I can go right on top of that. You can see the more dots you do, you get this kind of beautiful layering and textural feeling to it. And then these pens that I got, this one is a calligraphy pen, so you can't really do, you can really only do very tiny little dots, or kind of more like little strokes with that one. And I bought some of these, which were metallic, the gold and the silver, and I worked into the painting that way. So I'll just show you a little bit more work on the actual painting. I'm going to call it a painting because it was done with mostly watercolor markers. So if I want to go into an area and tone it down a little bit, just go in here. I don't know how well you can see what I'm doing. I'm just going over some of the darker areas, and then I immediately get a feeling like it's not quite as dark. It's a little bit more muted. And, you know, you just want to try, experiment with it. Don't be afraid. Like, I put a lot of different colors in here. I have yellows, I have greens, purples, blues. I have some of the pinks and oranges that I had in the sunset in the background, and I have that reflected through the water. Again, I'm not trying to do an exact interpretation. I always tend to go a little bit more abstract in my paintings. And even in my photographs, the title of the photograph was Beach Impression. I've always been influenced by a lot of the landscape artists and the impressionists, and I tend to do kind of impressionistic photos. And then in my paintings, I go even more in that direction. Paintings and drawings. I guess this could qualify as a drawing as well. Okay, so again, don't forget to do all of your experimentation, find out what your colors are, do the dots. You know, you can go for that monochromatic thing where you have maybe one color in one area, you know, and then going up. But the whole idea is that you are doing the different colors together. And then when you go with the border, you know, if you were doing a band of, let's try one, pink and orange, to make it blend a little bit better. Wait, I should do it on that other page. To make it blend a little bit better, I'll get my pink down. These were some other markers that I tried, which was very inexpensive. The Artist Loft markers. Now they're not as good because They're just not as good quality, but they have very tiny little dots. This actually looks fluorescent. I didn't try this one yet. And you can see the dot is quite a bit smaller. But what you would do if you're doing something like this is do a little blending between your border, and then you'll get, you know, the feeling that it's the two colors are mixing together a little bit, kind of like what you see in the actual spectrum, you know, in a rainbow. Like that. Now that's kind of a little bit harder to blend because this is almost like a fluorescent pink, and that's much more muted. Try adding another pink in here. Anyway, just experiment with it and have fun. Don't forget to look at all of the examples in the lecture. There's a lecture attached, and there's a lot of examples in the actual Blackboard lecture, and then I have an attached PDF, I think, of examples of student work as well. Okay, so you can work from a photo like I did. You can work from your imagination, you know, whatever you feel like doing. Just have fun with it. It does take quite a bit of time. You know, it'll probably take me a few more days to actually finish this. I did this in record speed. If you do larger dots, it'll go a lot faster. If you get the kind of person that goes crazy trying to do 50 million little dots, you can try just doing the strokes. You can see in here, I really did kind of little strokes when I was using the larger tip on those pens. And, you know, then when I had the smaller ones, I did tiny little ones. Okay, so have fun with this one. I'll do the other lecture pretty soon. For some reason, I forgot to do that one, the no tan in color, and then I was going to talk a little bit more about color theory, and I have some examples to show you too. I was having some technical issues and other family issues going on as well. Okay, so hope this helps. Have fun. Bye.